of WCAX-TV. So saddle up, buckaroo, as we recall the days of yesteryear with Chuck Wagentail's Dance Date and the Santa Claus Show, and of course, Across the Fence. Good afternoon, Happy New Year, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jolene Whitney. There's no noon news today. Instead, we've got an extended edition of Across the Fence. 2024 marked the 70th anniversary of WCAX-TV, and in a few weeks we'll celebrate 70 years of Across the Fence. Before we pop the champagne on our own anniversary, we're talking with somebody who's seen it all from our earliest days to today. Bob Blanchard is the administrator of the Facebook page Burlington Area History. That page was established in 2019, and it showcases the people and places of Vermont, along with a healthy helping of history. So welcome back and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you.
We're happy to have you here, and let's start a little bit with your own history with TV. Do you remember the first thing you watched?
I do, and it goes way back. We were living in an apartment, a middle apartment on Monroe Street, and my parents didn't have a television, but the upstairs apartment people did have a TV, and they invited me and my brother to go up, and we watched the old movie serials of Flash Gordon starring Buster Crabbe. I have a vivid memory of that because I guess it was the first time, and we didn't have a TV, so it was kind of a big deal. When we moved into our house, I don't remember when my parents got a TV. It was fairly early, but the first memory of television watching at that home was Captain Kangaroo, which came on not long after Channel 3 went on the air, and that was on six mornings a week, and it was must-see TV for kids.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned that must-see TV, and now we have streaming services, so it's kind of anytime you like, you can watch something.
Right.
But do you have any other examples of a time where you were making sure to tune in?
The one I really remember was when the movie The Wizard of Oz was only on once a year. On CBS, they started broadcasting it in the 50s, and if you missed it, you had to wait a year to see it.
Wow.
So and back then, nothing was broadcast in color when they first started. So you know how they morphed from the black and white in Kansas to the Oz in color. Oz was in black and white. So when CBS finally started broadcasting in color, I think it was 65, the Wizard of Oz was much more enjoyable.
I'm sure when they said to Yellow Brick Road, you're like, I'll have to take your word for it.
Yeah, it looks like dark gray to me. Right.
Wow, that's incredible. And so now let's jump into some of the photos that you've brought with you.
Sure.
The first one, we're starting at all the way at the top of Mount Mansfield. And so why is this location so significant?
Well, when the license was granted, it was for construction of the station with the tower on the top of Mount Mansfield, the highest peak point in Vermont, and that gave maximum broadcast coverage. And so that was where the tower, and they had to build a building for the equipment and the staff and everything else. It was a real challenge because it's a really tough environment to get stuff up to the top and to build, and you could only build during the summer.
Sure.
But they got it done, and the tower was really powerful and made for a great transmission.
And not to put you on the spot, but at some point that tower wasn't there anymore. Is that right?
I think there's still a tower of some sort.
Is that the one that wasn't there one that burned up there?
Well, that was much later, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But the tower in the photo that we just saw was replaced.
Sure, yeah.
At least once, and maybe more than once with updated equipment.
Nice, yeah.
Constant updates in electronics. So.
Absolutely, and we actually have an advertisement for Channel 3 as well.
Yeah, this was in a broadcasting magazine that I found, and you see it's WMVT, not WCAX, and that was the call letters that were on the original license. Creates a lot of confusion when you're doing history because you've got WVMT radio still, and then WMVT, of course, was changed to WCAX later. But for the first 10 months, it was WMVT.
It wasn't long lasting, only 10 months.
No, and I never have figured out why it was issued as WMVT, but we'll talk about call letters later. Maybe.
Yeah, don't worry, we're jumping into that one in full.
Right.
But we actually have a look at the first studio. It wasn't in Winooski, you said it was in Burlington, right? But it was pretty close to the line. This
was on Barrett Street. It was a former furniture warehouse. And it was a big building, one story, and yeah, very close to the Winooski Bridge. This was the home of the studio where everything was broadcast. Well, they had a studio in Montpelier too, but most of the programming came out of the Barrett Street studio, and the TV station was there for 4 years.
And all of this, kind of the start of Channel 3, was due to a man, Charles P Hasbrook.
Yes.
And how does he figure into starting Channel 3?
He was a newspaper man in Virginia, and he was publisher and president of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which was the most important newspaper in Virginia at the time. And I don't exactly know how it happened, but he bought the Burlington Daily News. Burlington used to have 2 daily papers at the time. And the Daily News also had a radio station, which was WCAX Radio. And just a side note, the station was owned in the newspaper by Horatio Nelson Jackson, who's very famous because he was the first man ever to drive across the United States.
Oh, wow.
So he sold the station and the paper to Hasbrook in 1939. And Charles Hasbrook was much more interested in broadcasting than newspapers at that point. So he sold the paper 3 years later and focused totally on broadcasting. And he really put a lot of effort into improving the broadcasting capability of WCAX radio. Then in 1952, he applied for a TV license. And it took a long time. There was a lot of red tape, dragging of the feet. Finally, in the spring of '54, it was approved, and then the construction on Mount Mansfield started.
Wow. And he wasn't alone in all of this.
No.
He has a man kind of on the inside who turned WMVT into WCAX.
Very much on the inside. He was in his family. He was his stepson. His name was Stuart Martin. They call him Red Martin. And he was a bit of a genius when it came to electronics, truly. I mean, his life history is just full of these incredible academic achievements, and during the war, he worked on radar and developed new radar techniques and equipment. After the war, he taught electrical engineering in prestigious colleges, and he was head of engineering for the Sylvania Electronics Corporation. But then when his stepfather told him about, building a station from scratch, he dropped everything, moved his family to Burlington, and started working on the transmission.
And we've teased this a couple times,
Yeah.
but the call letters did change after you said less than a year. And Across the Fence has always kind of believed that it was CAX stood for the College of Agriculture Extension,
Yes.
Which it means, of course, a lot to us, but that's not the case. What do you say?
Well, it's not the case, sadly, but
still believe it.
I actually had seen that, and I believed it for years too. But then I saw another article that said the call letter stood for College of Agriculture Experimental, because it was an experimental radio station. So I thought to myself, I wonder how solid this information is. So I did some digging, and I found a document that shows that in 1922, there were hundreds of radio stations operating by then. The federal government decided to issue call letters to all of them. And they were almost all 4 digits. There were a few with 3 digits. And so they all got a 4-letter call sign. The only letter that means anything is the W. That means you're east of the Mississippi. The other letters were just assigned in a sequence, alphabetical sequence. The first one assigned was WAAB. I don't know why they didn't do WAAA, but anyway, they just went WAAB, WAAC, just down the line. And finally, WCX was toward the end. WCAU was assigned to a Philadelphia station. WCAV went to a place in Little Rock, Arkansas. WCAW went to a station in a newspaper in Quincy, Illinois, and then WCAX went to the University of Vermont. That's how they got the call letters.
Wow.
And interestingly, by the mid-20s, only a few years after the call letters were issued, the federal government granted the ability to request custom call letters. So that bunch that were given the call letters initially, including WCAX, were probably about the only ones where they didn't get to choose their call letters. And that's why later you had WJOI, WDOT, WQCR Radio, that stood for Queen City Radio, and WVNY, Channel 22. You can pick them now.
Wow.
Yeah.
And WCAX officially went on the air September 29th at 9:54 at 6 p.m. And
Right.
so what was the first show to debut?
The first show was, you'd think it'd be the news at 6 o'clock, but it wasn't. It was Chuck Wagon Tales starring Dusty Boyd. And the show was a cowboy show, and Dusty Boyd was already kind of a personality before he came to Channel 3. He had a comic book, national comic book that had been written about him. They called him the Happy Cowboy. And he was very flamboyant and kind of a born entertainer. And the show was very popular. He featured cartoons, and he would tell tales, and he had guests. And He had cowboy shorts from the old movie days. And so less than 2 years later, he was actually, I hate to use the word poached, but
yeah, another station kind of borrowed
Channel 5, WPTZ, which went on the air like a month after Channel 3, they convinced Dusty to come over and work for them. He could not use the name Chuck Wagon Tales, so his show over there was called The Dusty Boyd Show. Sure, he didn't object to have his name in the title. But Channel 5, because Chuck Wagon Tales was so popular, they replaced Dusty Boyd with another cowboy host, and this is him, Zeb Lightfoot. And you can see the pose is very similar to the Dusty Boyd. There's a horse, a fringed leather outfit with a cowboy hat, and Zeb Lightfoot actually hosted Chuck Wagon Tales longer than Dusty Boyd did.
Wow.
Yeah, and so this next photo is the man who played Zeb Lightfoot.
Yeah, Howard Lancor, is that right?
Yeah, Howard Lancor, and he was from Massachusetts. He came up here to go to St. Michael's. He was there quite a while because he was in the Army for 2 years before he graduated, but he graduated in '55, and he was an accomplished actor. He had been in a lot of plays while he was up here in college, and so he was very, very comfortable, reading lines, reading scripted dialogue, and playing roles. So Dusty Boyd and the other things he did were kind of duck soup for him. He did a lot. He was there for 10. He was one of the first hires at Channel 3, and he was there for 10 years. And he did a lot. He was the host of Current Events Quiz for the first 10 years of that show's existence, for example. He did a lot of commercials. He did the news, as you saw in the photo. But then he left to go to a bigger station in Michigan.
Sure.
Yeah.
And local programming was kind of the king back in the day.
Yeah.
We have a picture of a schedule from 1956 on
Right.
WCAX.
Yeah.
And you can see across the fence, we've got some other stuff underlined in here. What really stands out to you?
Well, all the ones I've underlined and read were locally produced and broadcast live. The one that I don't know if any particular one stands out to me, but the Mixing Bowl was on for 11 years. A lot of them were 15-minute shows, and in the early days, the length of the shows changed a lot. Like Chuck Wagon Tales ran for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and an hour over its run. So there was a lot of some shows changed their name. It was all over the place. But the longer ones, like Across the Fence, those are the ones that really stick with you.
Yeah, and definitely like a lot shorter those time periods. You were saying they kind of fluctuated, but 15 minutes is
pretty quick.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. 15 minutes breezes by. At least today we've got half an hour.
Right, exactly.
And now let's talk a little bit about the local news. You had sports and weather, and that was kind of a station's bread and butter, and I mean, in a big way, it really still is.
Yeah.
And we've got an image here of the team. And who's this?
Well, the upper left is, of course, Stuart Martin is on the left, and on the right is J.A. Sullivan. He was the first news director. He stayed on until Richard Gallagher came in, so I can't remember exactly when J.A. Sullivan left, but he was there for 8 or 9 years. On the bottom left is, of course, Stuart Hall. Everybody remembers Stuart. And if you can see over his shoulder, he's got the weather map, and it says 25 below. So,
oh, geez.
yeah, those were quite the days back in those. Everybody says, oh, it was colder winters back then, and maybe they were. And then there was, of course, Tony Adams in the lower right with his bow tie. And this is the very first name for his show, Sports Digest. So on the very first night, Tony was on, and his show was Sports Digest.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yep.
And so let's talk a little bit more about some of the local programming, and this is one that's near and dear to people's hearts. And do you remember this one as well, the Santa Claus Show?
I do, because it ran into the 60s. I think it ended around 64. Yeah, the Santa Claus Show, of course, it was a simpler time. We all believed in Santa Claus for quite some time. And
myself and the viewers at home still believe in Santa Claus.
Okay, great.
Don't spoil anything for us.
That's all right. This was one of the first live shows on Channel 3. It was the third one that was created, and it started in December of '54. And the show was hosted by Stuart Hall, and the way it would open would be, it was 15 minutes, and the premise was kids would write letters to Santa, and Santa would read them on the air. So Stuart Hall would be the first face you saw, and then he would intro the show, and then he would say something like, calling the North Pole, and there would be kind of the blurry image, and then it would get clearer and clearer, and then you'd see that right there. Santa Claus with the Santa's workshop over his shoulder. And for a long time, I didn't know who did Santa Claus. I thought it was maybe Ken Green.
Santa himself, of course.
Yeah, you're right, well, exactly. But it turned out it was a guy named Bill Dow, who was an on-air personality for WCAX radio. And I don't think he ever appeared on the air, with one exception, on Channel 3 TV. So.
Wow.
Yeah, but anyway, that was a really popular show, and I wrote in, but my letter never got read. So
people would write in, and then Santa.
Yeah. We wanted to get the toys,
So. Shame you never got yours.
Oh well.
And let's talk about another show that you said that you weren't on either, but this one was Dance Date.
Right.
Is that right?
Dance Date was that was a long-running show that started on. In March of '56, and it ran around, I think it ran to 1969. And that was, again, kind of must-see TV, because popular music, rock and roll and all that, was really, really becoming popular in teenage culture and even people in their early 20s. And so it was kind of Channel 3's version of American Bandstand. So Ken Green hosted it for most of its run in the early years, and they would have kids from high schools around the state, and they would dance, and Ken would interview them. They'd have the top 10. Later on, in later years, they'd have the top 10 Billboard charts for that week listed. Here's another photo, just, kind of slow dancing. Ken's in the background. Unfortunately, his back is turned. But because it lasted so long and so late in '69, a lot of people are around who still remember that show. This picture is the second host, Val Carter. He was a very popular DJ. He founded WDOT Radio. He had a record shop on Church Street. You can see the Billboard Top 10. I don't know who the young lady is, but on the left you can see William Doolin, which was a clothing store in St. Albans. They provided her fashions. And the show was always sponsored by either Coke or Pepsi.
Oh.
Pepsi in this case.
Wow.
So that was the set, just a curtain with a bunch of hangings on it.
Yeah.
But quite memorable.
Sure, you don't really see local TV like that anymore.
You don't. You really don't.
And so let's stay with music for a little bit. You actually have a picture of Mike Stevens talking with an up-and-coming songstress. Who is he?
Mike Stevens' show is really little known. I had never heard of it, and I stumbled upon this doing other research. He was a Montreal radio personality, and because Montreal was in Channel 3's broadcast area, he was given this show on Channel 3. It was on in the afternoon, once a week, I think. And he would have all these various guests. This young lady, I think she was from Montreal too, Gigi Gallon, and she was a singer, and she was scheduled to be on the Tonight Show later in the week. So,
wow, bringing in the high rollers.
Yeah, it's kind of a big deal. But I don't, I never heard of her, so I guess it didn't go anywhere. But anyway, that lasted for 3 years, and people probably back in those days liked it, but I had no memory of it at all. It's before my time.
Sure. And you also brought in a photo of Brian Harwood. He was one of the hosts of Dance Date, and he was another kind of WCAX jack of all trades.
He was, yeah. Brian was the third host, and here he is doing a commercial for a television for Gaines Shoppers World, which was on Williston Road, and live. And he's really young there. Brian's still around, and he's in my group, and hear from him from time to time.
Nice.
And he was a very familiar face on TV. Then he had a long career in radio in Stowe and Waterbury.
Does he ever give you any intel into the early days of TV?
Once in a while he'll, slip me a little.
Sure,
little scoop
I remember that. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And in the early days of television, there was a big push from the federal government to kind of focus on some educational stuff. And you brought in some photos of old shows back then.
Right.
Talk about TV School to start with.
Well, this is a romper room that we're looking at. And that was a syndicated show for preschoolers. It's like a preschool on TV, really. You can see you got the do be and the don't be. And that's Miss Pat Nelson. She lived on Caroline Street. She was 22 years old. She was the school teacher. And the kids from the community would go on and, they would learn, I'm not sure what just, how to be good and stuff like that. They weren't into like the 3 R's or anything like that.
Sure.
They were too young. But I don't know how long it lasted, but when I posted this on the group, several people who were on the show, chimed in. So it's still within a lot of people's memory.
Sure. And there's one for some older students as well, right? Tell me about, is it a UVM lecturer?
Yeah, this is a UVM lecturer. And this was what was called TV University. So because there was a push for educational programming, the administrators at Channel 3 and UVM got together, and they came up with these programs. And what this one was, it was a show oriented toward adults. And it was broadcast on Saturday afternoon when the adults would not be working. It ran an hour, and you could take a full college course.
Wow, would you get credit?
I don't know, probably not, I'm guessing, but yeah. But this one was called Medieval Literature,
Wow.
so it was, it was pretty highbrow stuff.
Yeah, you'd hate to miss a show. You've missed a whole class.
Right. I don't know what the ratings were, but.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Across the Fence. We actually have, this is one of the early days, isn't that right?
This is the first day,
Wow.
first broadcast.
Bring
yeah.
back the barn door.
Yeah, the barn door was the backdrop for quite a while, and on the left is Dean Joseph Kerrigan. He was the dean of the College of Agriculture, and that included the extension service, and he was really the one responsible for Across the Fence being launched. The man on the right is named Lloyd Williams. He was a host for just a few weeks, and then a fellow named Joel Chandler became the first real full-time host of Across the Fence. But, it continues to this day, and it must be doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of shows that were on back then and continuing today, Quote Me was also a big show back then, isn't that right?
Yeah, You Can Quote Me was actually the very first show after Dusty Boyd, the very first show that was broadcast on Channel 3.
Wow.
October 11th, 1954, less than 2 weeks after the station went on the air. So this is a really long-running show. It was actually on in prime time, 7:30 on Friday night. And the photo is interesting because there's three reporters on the left, and none of them are from Chittenden County. And the guest was the governor of Vermont, and that's J.A. Sullivan, the news director. Sullivan's on the left, I'm sorry, and the governor's on the right.
Wow.
Governor, his name was Emerson.
Yeah, early on, and you already had some big names in there.
Yeah, for sure.
And now let's talk a little bit about two programs that prominently featured women, and these were locally produced, and they were kind of in some somewhat stereotypical roles for the 1950s as somewhat homemakers. But tell me, this was Mixing Bowl, is that right?
Yeah, the Mixing Bowl, that's Helen Workman, and she had a cooking show, and maybe you didn't notice, but in the diagram of the studio on Barrett Street, they had a full kitchen set up just for this show. And it started only 15 minutes, but I think it went to a half hour at some point. It was on in the afternoon, and it was a perennial. It lasted 11 years, and I think it only went off the air because she got a job as head of the Red Cross, and
Sure.
left.
Yeah.
So it was very popular, and not like today where there's cooking shows all over the place. It was kind of rare to see that, so people like seeing the recipes, and she actually made the things, during her show. So
Absolutely, and Marco Ayala's not carrying on that tradition. And we have another one, Shopping with Nancy.
Yeah, Shopping with Nancy. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of the actual show, but that's Nancy Parker in the upper left, and she was kind of a do-everything lady at Channel 3, and she had a show. This was her first show. It was called Shopping with Nancy, and she would go to the stores on Church Street and look for bargains or look for, cute outfits, or I don't know what she did, but it was shopping, and twice a week, 15 minutes, and then she would show her bargains, and this show didn't last all that long. I think it was on a couple of years.
And quiz shows were also all the rage back then. So
Yes.
what was WCAX's contribution?
Yeah, quiz shows were really big nationally, as were cowboy shows, and so WCAX started Current Events Quiz in October of 1956. And it ran for, I think, 21 years, so it was a long-running show. And here we have the winners of a year, and what it did was it was mostly junior high schools kids, and they would be quizzed on current events, the events of the previous week. So if you read the Free Press cover to cover and had a good memory, you stood a good chance of doing well. The man on the left is Charles Lewis, and he was associated with Channel 3 for a long, long time. And he was on You Can Quote Me for years, and he was also the judge and the timekeeper on Current Events Quiz, and Ken Green was the host. And you can see they got a trophy at the end. So
Good for them. And we've got a couple more, is that right?
I think there's one of Ken Green at the moderator's desk, and he's got the two teams on either side of him, and you can see the camera, and so that was the format. Yeah.
And is this one was it a word search, crossword?
Yeah, this was called Cartmel's crossword quiz, and the host was Stuart Hall. And that's Nancy Parker again. She was kind of like his Vanna White, I guess.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Of shopping fame, Nancy Parker.
Right, and so Cartmel was a local appliance dealer, and the show featured married couples competing against each other, and the prize was quite substantial. You got a major appliance if you won, like a washing machine, and that was a better prize than a lot of national quiz shows were giving back then. But that ran, it was a half hour, and it was on in the evening, and it ran a couple of years. And then, you know, that was the end of it. But it was interesting because they pitted the married couples against each other. So you kind of wonder if you didn't do well, what happened at home.
And we've only time for one more photo, but this is a current events quiz, and this is Ken Green here.
Yeah.
Can you describe kind of his influence on TV news in Vermont?
Well, after Howard Landcore left, Ken Green had actually departed Channel 3 for WMTW TV in Poland Spring, Maine. I guess he was blocked by Howard Landcore, but then Howard Landcore left, and Ken Green was offered the job of chief announcer, and he came right back. I don't think he was in Maine for a year even. So he came back to Channel 3, became chief announcer, and he did everything. As we said, he was on Dan State. He did current events quiz after Landcore left. He did tons of commercials. You see him with the car there. One camera's on Ken, the other camera's looking at the engine, and so again, everything was live. So he was a busy guy, and he had a great voice, and people just remember he filled in on the news, and I think he actually did the weekend news for a while.
Sure, jack of all trades.
He did everything, yeah. So, and he just had a voice that still sticks in your head to this day, and so he was really an important person in the history of Channel 3.
Absolutely, and that's all the time we have for today, so thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely, and that takes care of Across the Fence for today. For me and our crew here at WCAX, we wish you a happy and healthy 2025. This is Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have a good one.